In this video, I'll take a look at the newest published adventure from the Wizards of the Coast, the Wild Beyond the Witchlight. This 5e adventure has a lot to offer, and I'll go over what I think is great about the adventure and what I think is less great about the adventure. I'll also discuss which kind of DM I think this adventure is for, so you can decide whether or not you should run it at your table. So yeah, without further ado, let's take a look at this review of the Wild Beyond the Witchlight. My name is J.A. Valeur, and as some of you may know, I am a publisher for 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. I publish my own modules and content over at Patreon and Kickstarter, and I also publish on the DM's Guild, where I have a series of DM's guides available for most of the published adventures. I've been holding off on doing a review of the Wild Beyond the Witchlight for a while now, because I wanted to make sure that I've read through all of the book, of course, and also that I've begun playing it at least, so I have a sense of how it unfolds in action. First off, I'm super happy that we finally get an adventure that has a cohesive story and structure. This is something that we really lacked in Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden, where the adventure was like Humpty Dumpty just put together. In the case of the Wild Beyond the Witchlight, everything is quite clearly connected, so the story feels as one story. Now, there are some issues with how the story is presented, and I'll go over that later in the video. But I think that just having a cohesive story and structure is really beneficial and something that is really nice when you compare to some of Wizards of the Coast other adventures. It's also a huge help that we get 2 viable hooks that will actually get the characters invested in the adventure. Icewind Dale, Rime of Frost Maiden notoriously didn't really have a hook at all. It just expected the adventurers to go on an adventure. Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus was much the same, no real hook. The characters was just expected to care about anything and go along. In the Wild Beyond the Witchlight, we get 2 hooks. You can choose either one. I actually suggest combining them, possibly, to bring the characters into the adventure, and these hooks work well on their own and can each get the characters where they need to go, or at least most of the way. They will get the characters involved in the adventure, and that is a huge step up from having no hook at all. I also have to applaud the adventure on its strong theme, and that's a theme that's there throughout. It has a personality of its own. It's this whimsical, mystical, a bit dark sometimes, grisly adventure, and I think that's a cool theme to have, and it really sticks to it throughout, which of course is also an upside. I like that the adventures have some personality and don't just feel like any old adventure. Overall, the adventure should also get praise for the amount of cool content you get. There's a bunch of encounters in the book, and there's a bunch of stuff for the characters to do. There's a lot of new creatures and magic items. I think that overall you can't really be disappointed with the amount of content that we get. There's also great maps in there. There's not enough of them. That's something I'll get into later as well. But the maps that we do get are really great. It's Will Doyle and Stacey Allen, I believe, who's created the maps, and I like their full color style. Then there's also the extras that we get. We get a story tracker and role-playing cards, and these are add-ons that we can use in game to keep a handle on everything and make it easier to play at the table. And this is something that I find works really well. Especially the story tracker is a concept that I'm very impressed by. Just having some sheets where you can write down notes in an organized manner, or you can check off boxes if the characters did this or that. That is something that is hugely beneficial, and something that I think the writers have actually done a very good job at keeping throughout, where they'll say, if the characters do this, note down that, so you can remember it in chapter 3 where this happens. This is just a great concept, and something that I hope that Wizards of the Coast will do in their later adventures as well, and something that I would think about adopting when I write adventures for 5th edition. That's not the only extra content we get, of course. There's also the races and the backgrounds. The backgrounds aren't really my cup of tea, but I generally don't put a lot of stock into backgrounds. I don't think they're hugely important. I think that I'd much rather have the characters come up with their own background and then just give them some proficiencies. But if you like backgrounds, I guess that they are serviceable, but I think they do create some issues with the narrative and don't really fit that well, perhaps. So those I'm not impressed by, but the races are great to have in the book. I think it's fun that they stick them in the book. There is unfortunately also some downsides to the adventure. I initially thought that it would be mostly positive, but as I went through the book, read everything, and have started writing these guides for it and playing it for our groups, it really shows that there is still some stuff that I think Wizards of the Coast need to improve on. The first thing is that I think the adventure is generally too short and too fast paced. If you just open the book and see that there's 200 plus pages, you'll get the sense that it's a long adventure, but it is only from 1st to 8th level, and even getting that many levels in there is kind of a stretch. As I see it, this adventure could be played through in a reasonable manner in 15, maybe 20 sessions, and I think that is far fewer than what we got out of Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frostmaiden, and Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus, just to name a few. I think we even spent more sessions than that in Waterdeep Dragon Heist. And this is a mix between it being less focused on combat, which generally takes a lot of time out of game, but also that the encounters that we get, while they are described in detail and they're very long, there are many pages dedicated to an encounter, it doesn't necessarily take as long to play out in-game. And even though the adventure only goes to 8th level or finishes at 8th level, it's still very fast-paced. If you're running it by the book, there's a good chance that you'll be taking your characters from 1st to 4th level in the first 3 sessions, perhaps even only 2. And that is, in my opinion, just very, very fast, especially if there's not a whole lot of combat in there to maybe warrant them getting that combat experience. So the level advancement generally in the book isn't that great. It's a bit too fast, and it's also something that comes in clumps, if you can say that, where a character will go from 2nd to 3rd and then 10 minutes later out of game go to 4th level, because that is how the book has set up level advancement. And of course, in my opinion, maybe that is something you would need to correct, and something that I do address in our DM's resources. The adventure also sort of seems open in the sense that you have these areas where there are different locations and places the characters can go, but when you actually run through them, they are written quite linear, where the characters go to A and then they're told about B, they go to B, then they're told about C, they go to C, and then they end up at the location, the main location in the realm that they're in, and from there they can go to the next realm and sort of start over again. So we have this still kind of railroady adventure. It is better in some sense than other adventures, because the characters may feel less railroaded. They're not explicitly told you need to go here and do that all the time. Sometimes it's just the obvious choice that they make. And I also think that the encounters in general have a lot of different solutions to how you handle them, which will of course give the players that sense of agency. But from a story and structure perspective, it is really still a quite linear adventure. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you prefer linear adventures with a cohesive story, that's a good thing. But I do think that the authors could have done a bit more to make it more open, and that's also something that I will explore in future videos. The adventure also has this concept of combat being avoidable, where it will really focus on trying to make all encounters, or it says that all encounters can be avoided without combat. Now, this is something that I was lukewarm on to begin with, and very curious about how they would handle. Generally, I think they handle it pretty well. You get a lot of descriptions of how you can avoid this encounter, or how you can talk with that creature instead of fighting it, and how much it will take for it to actually become annoyed enough with the characters to fight them, and so on. But I also think that it sorts of make the book more verbose than it needs to be. There's a lot of more words in here that we probably don't need. There's a lot of this that the DM probably knows already, or that is already allowed within 5e D&D, where we don't need to be told it again and again. This encounter can be avoided by doing the following. It also creates this weird dynamic sometimes, where it seems that the adventure just assumes that combat won't break out, even though it's rather likely that it will. And then we don't really get told what we're supposed to do if the characters get into an encounter with an NPC that is 5 levels higher than their own. And that is, of course, an issue, I think. I think it would be probably better for the book to have said that most encounters can be handled without combat, and then still having combat be the main solution to some encounters, and doing a proper job of explaining how combat would unfold here, or how the DM is supposed to handle it if it breaks out. And that sort of leads to the other point, because it seems like having all encounters be non-combat encounters, or potential non-combat encounters, is also an excuse to not make as many battle maps. Personally, I'll never run a complex combat encounter without a battle map, and not having these maps provided in the book is a real downside. There is, I think, less than 10 maps in the book, and while these are big maps for big locations, there are a lot of encounters sprinkled in there where I could easily see combat, and where combat has erupted in our game, and that has left us without a map, or required me to make our own maps, which of course is something that not every DM has the time, opportunity, or skills to do. So I would have loved for Wizards of the Coast to put a bit more maps in there and maybe allow us the assumption that some of these non-combat encounters could be combat encounters. Now, my final and probably biggest criticism of the adventure is that while it presents itself as a beginner adventure, it has a whole page or two dedicated to actually explaining new DMs how to run D&D in the start of the book, which is something quite new. This adventure isn't easy to run. As I said previously, the story is actually cohesive and the structure is quite easy to follow, but it's actually very poorly explained in the first chapter, the introduction to the book. We get, of course, a summary of the adventure. We understand that and there's spoilers ahead, big spoilers ahead, so be careful. We understand that there's an archfey that has been trapped in time. We understand that the characters probably need to go freed and these hacks are behind it. But there's also a lot of information we don't get, and that I think as DMs we need to have. We're not told that Sibylna, this trapped archfey, is Igwilv or Tasha or whatever you want to call her. We're not simply not told in the first chapter of the book who the main antagonist or protagonist of the book is, who the entire adventure revolves around, and that's a 2-sentence explanation that could have been given. There's also a lot of old Dungeons & Dragons NPCs, some Easter eggs of a sort, some nostalgia gifts that we get that are tucked into mostly the last chapter of the book, but also sprinkled throughout, and we're not told about these in the introduction at all. And to me this seems like the writers of the book wanted the DM to sort of experience the twist as well. Oh, the archfey is really also Tasha, this witch, and here are these fun NPCs you might remember from back in the day. But I think that's a wrong approach to do if you're writing an adventure. We really want to, as the DMs, to know everything beforehand. Just summarized in the first chapter. We want that flowchart that we're also not getting. That is something that I usually love to have in the books. Another thing that I'm really not stoked about is that we're told in the introductory chapter that there is an unicorn horn somewhere in the adventure and that this horn is very important and features a large part in the plot. But we're not told what it does. We're not told that it's used to free Sibylna from the time stasis she's in. The book doesn't tell us that. It just tells us this horn is important and you should place it where you want to. Here's some option for where to place it. But if I don't know at that point what I'm using the horn for, what it's supposed to do when the characters will need it, then I can't place it in the adventure. And to me, that's just indefensible. I think it's a huge oversight, and having that information would be far more beneficial to new DMs than having a half a page on how to run D&D, which is something that new DMs should probably just read in the player's handbook or the starter set or wherever else they go. So after going over the positives and the negatives, the question that remains is, should you run the adventure? Which kind of DM is it for? And is that you? And should you go out and buy it? Would I go out and buy it if I hadn't done so already? First off, this adventure may try to package itself as a beginner adventure, but in my opinion, it really isn't a beginner adventure. Sure, there's a lot of stuff in there that's good for a beginner, getting the story tracker and the role-playing cards, and the story is structured and cohesive, and there's also, as I mentioned, these sort of summaries of how a DM should perform when running an adventure in the starter book. But the adventure itself is actually quite difficult. The Witchlight Carnival, the entry chapter of the book, is extremely difficult in my opinion to run. There's a ton of locations that you have to keep your eye on at all times, and you have to roleplay a multitude of different NPCs. And if you have new players, they have to be able to interact with so many different and quirky and odd NPCs. So yeah, to me, this adventure tries to be a beginner adventure, but I would really go with something like the Lost Mine of Phandelver or a similar much easier adventure if you're looking to run your first D&D adventure. That being said, I do think that the stuff that we get with the adventure, the story tracker, the role-playing cards, the new races, the backgrounds, the magic items, monsters, the fun descriptions, I think there's a lot of good content in this book. There's a lot of cool ideas. The imagination has run wild on some of them, and I absolutely love it. Our players love it. So there's a lot of good to say about the adventure. It just irks me that there's still these sort of very easy to fix mistakes that I think Wizards of the Coast keep making. But overall, would I buy it again if I hadn't already? Yes, I would. Would I run it? I am running it, and I would run it knowing what I know now. It is a fun adventure. It's a good adventure. It's just something, again, that needs a bit of work. And yeah, that's it for me in this one. If you like what we do here, you can support us on patreon.com/eventyr. You can also just like and subscribe and comment on the video. What are your thoughts on the adventure? Is there something that I didn't cover that you think I should have talked about? And beyond that, there's not a whole lot left to say, except thank you for following along, and I hope that I'll see you in the next video.